So in primary hip replacement, two of the big issues are wear, but also instability. And Dan Berry looked at the Mayo Clinic series and found an average dislocation rate over time of 4.1%. This tended to increase over time, especially with metal and polyethylene hips, and it tended to decrease with an increased size of femoral heads. Most series would show an increased risk of dislocation with a posterior rather than an anterolateral approach. And the problem with hips that are dislocating is that when you revise a hip for instability, the failure rate is higher than revisions for any other cause, including infection. So what is the redislocation rate? Well, several authors have reported between 7 and 29% failure rate due to further dislocations. What about constrained liners? Unfortunately, they're also not the solution, with reported failure rates between 8 and 29%. What about dual mobility? Well, we know that dual mobility gives you a great range of freedom of the hip in a inner articulation between the ceramic head and the polyethylene head. You get about 76 degrees of movement, assuming a 28mm head and 11mm neck. And in the outer articulation, the range of motion you get before impingement, it varies between 126 and 140 degrees. So putting this all together, for, say, a 53mm cup in 45 abduction, 20 anteversion, 15 degrees femoral anteversion, and a femoral neck thickness of 11mm, you get a theoretical range of motion that is outside the range of the human hip. So these hips are very, very stable. The St. Etienne group, who invented the dual mobility hip, have the most experience with recurrent revision hip replacement for recurrent dislocation. They published 37 revision total hip replacements, revised for dislocation, and 80% of them had already had one failed procedure, and their results were no subsequent dislocations. Begwin reported at the Softcot meeting 42 unstable hip replacements treated by dual mobility conversion. 17 cases the components were accurately aligned, and 25 cases had some malalignment, either cup or the stem. And of the 42, they had 41 successful revisions with conversion to dual mobility. One case redislocated. Also in Southampton, this group reported 45 revisions for recurrent dislocation with a 5-year follow-up, posterior approach, conversion to dual mobility, no further dislocations. Even a multi-centre study in France of 11 institutions reported at Softcot, they recorded 180 revisions for recurrent instability with an average of 2.5 previous operations for this problem and only one subsequent dislocation. So I've done a few of these. I've done 5 of these, just dual mobility conversions for troublesome patients with recurrent dislocations. 4 I just converted to dual mobility system, and 1 I had to redo the stem because there was some metallosis. I'd just like to take you through these cases. Case 1 was an 81-year-old female, had a pinnacle Karai hip in January 2015, a 52mm shell and 36mm femoral head. She'd had 5 posterior dislocations and many minor subluxations. At surgery, her hip was unstable. The leg was a few millimetres short. I measured the cup with the IntelliJoint navigated measuring system. The cup was 45 degrees and 10 degrees anteverted. So I removed the cup and replaced it with a dual mobility shell, and I increased the leg length by a plus 7mm sleeve and a dual mobility head. And the case outcome is no further dislocations, no activity or movement restrictions. She's off travelling the world and very happy. Case 2, an 80-year-old medical practitioner. He had a left total hip replacement through an anterolateral approach. He had 5 anterior dislocations from 2014 on. He was dislocating in bed. He had a cemented stem with a modular neck and a ceramic articulation. The operative findings with him, he was unstable in 20 degrees of external rotation and extension. He had some metallosis, but I thought at 80 it was probably acceptable. He had some stripe wear on the ceramic head, and the cup and the stem were solid. So what I did for this case, I removed the head and the liner, and I retained the 58mm shell and I cemented in a 47mm monoblock dual mobility type cup, and I added a 7mm sleeve onto the modular neck and a dual mobility head to give me a bit more offset. And the outcome of that, immediate weight bearing, no further dislocations. He's also enjoying his retirement. Case 3 was a 67-year-old female, Pinnacle Karai, 2012 through a posterior approach, 52mm shell, 36mm ceramic on poly, and neutral sleeve. She had 2 posterior dislocations in 2015, only 3 years after surgery. I found that she was unstable at 90 of flexion and 70 of internal rotation, so she was reasonably stable, but she had, I think, just problem bending over too far. So I revised her cup, added a bit of length to the sleeve and put in a dual mobility system, and again, she's no further dislocations, no restrictions, and she subsequently had bilateral knee replacement under my care. Case 4 was an 80-year-old female, had a hybrid total hip replacement for a fractured neck of femur in June 2017. She started off badly. She dislocated in the recovery ward. It was reduced. She had 2 further posterior dislocations. She was cancelling a travel plan. She had an 80-year birthday trip around the world planned. She was very unstable at 40 degrees of flexion, 15 internal rotation. The cup was too steep. There was no anti-version. This was also measured with the IntelliJoint system. So I revised the cup, put in a dual mobility ceramic and poly head, and I added a little bit to the sleeve for a bit more offset. She's had no further dislocations, no restrictions. And the final case was a 59-year-old male, big wave surfer. He had a right total hip replacement in 2009. From 2014, he started dislocating posteriorly. He was a posterior approach. He had a 56mm shell. It was a metal on metal with a short stem and a modular neck, and he was 1 centimetre short. I measured his chromium and cobalt preoperatively. They were both elevated. At surgery, he had a lot of metallosis from the modular neck. He was unstable in flexion, internal rotation. I was worried that he'd be dislocated out in the surf, he would drown. So the cup was at 48 degrees abduction. I thought I could probably work with that, and 14 degrees antiversion. So in this case, I kept the cup, revised the stem, put on a dual mobility system. He was stable. At the end, he was stable in all positions, and he's back. He immediately said his hip felt more stable. He's had no further dislocations. He's back surfing, and very confidently so, and so am I. So in summary, in primary hip replacement, I think it's pretty well established that dual mobility hips are extremely stable, lowest dislocation rate. And in revision total hips, dual mobility hips are the most stable option. And I think dual mobility conversion for recurrent dislocation has a very high success rate, better than constrained liners, etc. So if you have a patient with recurrent instability, think dual mobility. Thank you.